Hi, I'm Sharad Agarwal, Senior Vice President at EasyMile. I've been in the transportation sector for the last 15 years across numerous different areas in mobility. EasyMile is one of the leading companies in driverless autonomous technology. We have two major pillars that we are focusing on. The first being material handling, where we're really interested in bringing to life the actual autonomous movements of big vehicles and small vehicles on material handling yards. The second one is mobility, which is really moving large groups of people in small distances in large density areas. One of the things interesting about EasyMile is that we're very focused on technology to become driverless when it's under 20 miles an hour, which is a little bit different than what we're seeing across the world. But we're very focused on bringing low-speed mobility in full autonomy to there. Well, what's interesting about the life right now is that there are three major disruptions happening on mobility. The first one is electrification. They're really going to see a major shift with all vehicle types, whether it's personal car ownership or fleets, moving towards electrification in the next few years. And that's really being supported by a lot of federal dollars and federal initiatives, not only in the US, but all over the world, to really push electrification in mobility, starting with car ownership, but also into all types of fleet. And that really helps to increase the capital to get out there to buy not only the vehicles, but also setting up some of the infrastructure like chargers that are required. So one of the major impacts that we see right now is electrification. The second really big impact that we're going to see in mobility in the next couple of years, or already have started to see, is really an increasing in shared mobility. And when I talk about shared mobility, that's not only just ride sharing and ride hailing, which is usually the first thing that everybody thinks about, but that also means more public transit ridership, because that's been maybe the more historic shared mobility that's been out there. But there's a huge increase towards public transit ridership, but also even car sharing, scooters, those types of things are also shared mobility, where you're sharing an asset to move around. And so that's going to be another really big impact on the future. And in most of these modes are all electric. And so you're seeing a big shift in each of these modes moving towards shared mobility, but also being electric shared mobility. And the third one, which gets probably the most press, is really autonomy. Autonomy is coming. It is going to happen. I think it's very likely that there's going to be an impact. There's going to be a huge impact to society, but this is something that is definitely coming. And right now, everything in the autonomous space is electric. And so you are seeing this shift towards the energy sector and on the electric side. What's interesting about this one is that we don't really know the impact one way or the other on energy. I think it's definitely there's going to be a shift to electric, but there's going to be additional power required to have the vehicles operate with the sensors, the cameras, and the computers. There's also potential for maybe reduced drag because the sensors are not flush against these aerodynamic designed cars. So there could be, it's kind of an open question maybe at this point of how autonomy is going to impact the increase. Is it going to increase the use of energy or decrease? The one thing we do know that it is going to be an electric future in autonomy. What I think is the kind of the curious thing about these three different major disruptions happening on mobility is that they are going to converge. And so ultimately, we're going to end up in a world with electric shared autonomous mobility. And so each of these three areas that are being more or less in parallel right now and a little bit of overlap, they're going to ultimately end up overlapping. And we're going to see that in a reality, you're going to have this electric autonomous shared mobility ecosystem to figure out what the world is going to be moving towards. So I think when you're looking at the energy sector, it says, okay, if we know this is the future of what the mobility is going to look like, and in consumption of fuel right now is primarily in this mobility sector, it's really understanding like what should we be thinking about from an energy perspective and where to make the investments. And so I don't think it's the same as today, because when you have an electric autonomous shared mobility, it's not the same as people having gas car ownership and how they move and when they move and where they move. So I think it's important to start thinking about that. And to me, there's really three areas where that impact is important. So the first one really is going to be when I mentioned a little bit, is what's the use case, usage of energy going to be? You definitely have an increasing population for the most part across the world, and especially in the U.S. You also, and that's based both on people living longer, but also the birth rates that are increasing. So you're going to have a larger population one way or the other. So that should impact what's happening with the amount of energy required. But then also you might see that there's a lot more movements with the elderly population or for those that are not generally very mobile. if you have an autonomous service, that could really increase the amount of movements that are happening. So even though we might be in more of an electric sector and the idea of shared mobility, there might just be a lot more movements. And so there's a big open question to really understand is like, what do we see the movements and look like? Does that really create more or less energy? So that's one of the key areas to be thinking about in this sector. And the second one, which is really important, is the infrastructure location. We clearly know that there's a big infrastructure change that's going to be required. And right now, that's really putting chargers in the system. I know the Biden administration has announced like 500,000 chargers to be put in all across the country. There's a lot of other grants and initiatives. But the question is that today, we're driving our cars and we need the convenience of a chargers if we're driving cross country or if we're going to our office or in dense downtown areas. However, if you get into an autonomous mobility segment, then maybe the vehicles are not charging in the city because people are taking a shared ride, getting dropped off, and what the kind of a lot of the question marks is maybe they're charging outside the city. So do you really want to increase your grid power inside of a city to support electric cars? Do you really want to create charging systems in the middle of town when in reality with shared mobility, most likely the charging is going to be done outside the dense areas in large open spaces or in areas where the vehicles that don't need drivers to go there, don't need the convenience to charge, is to be over in that area. And the other part of it to think about is that the type of charging systems today are being built with plug-ins. So you walk up to the car and you plug it in because it's a manned vehicle. But when it comes to autonomous vehicles, the vehicles charge itself. So you want to have either a wave charging or some kind of wireless charging. So the systems could be very different to what we're putting in today that maybe even in less than 10 years, you're going to have to change. So thinking about really how the disruption is going to happen between shared and autonomous mobility is a major impact on infrastructure because these aren't minimal investments. These are billions, trillions of dollars in investments that may have to be replaced in sub 20 years, which from an infrastructure perspective is quite soon. So really thinking about where infrastructure location makes the most sense, I think, is another key one. The third one is really regulation. From our perspective, the autonomous technology, not just our company, but most companies in the industry, if they were living in a fully autonomous world or in a fully autonomous city, then we would be a lot closer to full autonomy than waiting to try to figure out how to get in between manned drivers and manned pedestrians. So to create some kind of certainty, I would see a lot of push in the regulations and maybe get some feedback from cities to say, okay, we are moving to this fully driver-free zones in the next 5-10 years, and then we could really help design some of the first two that I talked about is saying, okay, well, if we're definitely moving to an autonomous zone, then we don't want to be putting necessarily chargers in that area, or we're not putting infrastructure into that space, not building new roads, because these are the areas we know that autonomy is going to increase capacity on public roads because of how close they can travel together. So these are all the things that if we can really help press regulation, I'm thinking more like at the state and local level where they're making their plans for autonomy, that could really help some certainty for the energy sector to know how to build their infrastructure and develop their the usage in the future. So I feel like that's another really kind of key thing to be focused on, is trying to get some more certainty out of the cities on what their autonomous plans are, because that could be a big help. So with all that said, I think just from my own opinion, I think about where we could be putting some efforts into now, just knowing that what may not be disrupted in the future with autonomy. And the first one I think of is airports. Airports aren't going anywhere. Airplanes aren't going anywhere. I think in reality, it's probably going to increase. It seems to be the worldwide trend that there's going to be more planes. So all of that land, though, that the airports currently have, which is usually on the outside of town, you have probably a major shift from rental cars not being required, probably more parking not required. So you're going to have these major open parking lots and a lot of space available at the airports, which could be a great place to invest in electric infrastructure now, because that could be not only a charging hub for these autonomous vehicles, but also a place to just have maintenance and repair, because it's already land that's there and doesn't have to be reclaimed and most likely owned by the cities to begin with, or to be supported. I think another area that could be really helpful is factories. I mentioned earlier one of our focuses at EasyMile is material handling. But we know that definitely there's going to be a lot of move in electric vehicles, whether it's moving containers, whether it's trucks on campus, all that kind of thing. And the factories, again, have major footprints. If they don't have employees coming to their locations anymore because they're shared mobility, there could be some opportunities to build charging centers there They already require a lot of power, so building a grid is already part of that requirement. So I think that the factories in industrial areas could be really good places to start building infrastructure that is not going to be disrupted. They're not going to be going anywhere. So we know in the future that these areas would be the same. So it would be not a bad risk to put some money into there. And then I think the last area from the urban density side is that I really believe that like the long distance, bus depots and train stations, those aren't going anywhere anyways. With the push towards shared mobility, we're still going to have these major hubs of increased bus traffic and train traffic into the different areas, and so those might not be bad areas to continue to invest in also, because in general those aren't going anywhere. So overall, that's my impact. I think my background is in the autonomous side, and we know that this is a reality that's happening, and focusing really on electric and shared mobility, and it's just a matter of time when this is going to happen. And I think it's good to start thinking about it today on how we plan across all sectors, but really important in the energy side. Thank you.